There are a number of lessons that we can learn from church history, but maybe one of the most important is that whoever controls the language controls the debate. Let's talk about that. Well, hello everyone. Welcome back to Schola Fides. I'm Hutch, and today we're looking at the news. The first article that I want us to take a peek at is this one. It's from the New York Times. This is an opinion piece that was written by Mr. Farhad Manjoo. The headline reads, "It's time for they." The singular they is inclusive and flexible, and it breaks the stifling prison of gender expectations. Let's all use it. This was written on July 10th of this year. I'm sorry that I'm just getting to it now, but it got buried in my Google Alerts folder. Here's what he writes in the body of the article. He says, "I am your stereotypical cisgender middle-aged suburban dad. I dabble in woodworking, I take out the garbage, and I covet my neighbor's Porsche. Though I do think men should wear makeup, it looks nice. My tepid masculinity apparently rings loudly enough online and in person that most people guess that I go by he and him. And that's fine. I will not be offended if you refer to me by those traditional, uselessly gendered pronouns. But he is not what you should call me. If we lived in a just, rational, inclusive universe, one in which we were not also irredeemably obsessed by the particulars of the parts dangling between our fellow humans' legs, nor the ridiculous expectations signified by those parts about how we should act and speak and dress and feel, there would be no requirement for you to have to assume my gender just to refer to me in the common tongue. There are, after all, few obvious linguistic advantages to the requirement. When I refer to myself, I don't have to announce my gender and all the baggage it carries. Instead, I use the gender nonspecific I. Nor do I have to bother with gender when I'm speaking directly to someone or when I'm talking about a group of people. I just say you or they. So why does standard English impose a gender requirement on the third person singular? And why do elite cultural institutions, universities, publishers, and media outlets like the Times still encourage all this gendering? To get to my particular beef, when I refer to an individual whose gender I don't know here in the Times, why do I usually have to choose either he or she, or, in the clunkiest phrase ever cooked up by small-minded grammarians, he or she? Now, before we continue with this article, there are a few things that I want to note just from the outset. The very first thing is that Mr. Manjoo is making a moral argument here. This can be seen when he uses the word should. It's also picked up here in this sentence where he says, if we lived in a just, rational, inclusive universe. And so, from the outset, we need to understand that what Mr. Manjoo is advocating for here is a moral change. He is advocating that using a non-gendered or a non-gender specific pronoun is a moral ought, right? That is what is signaled by the word should. And he is calling for, in this particular editorial, the rejection of the traditional gendered pronouns and instead advocating for replacing them with they. But I don't think we should overlook the moral aspect of what he's arguing here and what he's arguing for. You see, his argument is that using they instead of the traditional gendered pronouns is a moral necessity. It is an ought. And because it's a moral necessity, because it's an ought, because we should, refer to him by a non-gender specific pronoun, then it is necessarily morally superior to using the traditional language of he and she. And the very first thing that I think that this points out to us is that language is not unimportant. It is inseparably tied to the moral and gender revolution that we see happening in the broader culture around us. And that's the reason that language is in itself so important. That's the reason that free speech is so much on my mind and on the mind of others. And it's because language is ultimately entwined with thought. Indeed, I think it is entwined with the very ability to think. And so the one who controls the language ultimately controls the culture. And this is the problem with enforced language codes. Now, this is to say nothing of the confusion that necessarily results from using a plural noun when referring to a singular individual. That is secondary at most. But I want to see this as well. This is something that he comes up a little bit later here in the article when he's speaking of his own children. He says, "But it was only when I had a son and a daughter of my own that I recognized how powerfully gendered constructs shape our development. From their very earliest days, my kids, fed by marketing and entertainment, and surely their parents' modeling, seemed to hem themselves into silly gender norms. They gravitated to boy toys and girl toys, boy colors and girl colors, boy TV shows and girl TV shows. This was all so sad to me. I see them limiting their thoughts and their ambitions, their preferences and their identity, their very liberty, only to satisfy some collective abstraction. And there's very little prospect for escape. Gender is a ubiquitous prison for the mind, reinforced everywhere by everyone and only rarely questioned. We're a long way from eradicating these expectations in society, but we don't have to be wary about eradicating them in the language." You see, what Mr. Manju understands and what is stated so clearly here in his article is the fact that one really cannot eradicate these gendered expectations in society until you eradicate them in the language. And the problem, of course, is that as Christians, we understand that Christ in Matthew chapter 19 mentions that from the beginning God made mankind male and female. And that is the very reason that Mr. Manju's own sons and daughters from their earliest days hemmed themselves, to use his words, into gender norms. That's because there is something increated in humanity that points us towards what it is to be male and female. This isn't simply a societal construct. I think it's worth pointing out here that this is the reason that Christians necessarily have to push back against the very concept of things like speech codes and enforced language. And that's because it forces us we might as well say, the point of a gun, especially if there is some sort of imprisonment that is guaranteed or that is potentially going to be enforced if one refuses to use these pronouns. It is, in effect, to force Christians to point at reality and use language that does not correspond with the biblical view of reality. And as a Christian, I can't do that. Now, the other article that we need to take a look at isn't an article per se. This is a post from Instagram from Joshua Harris. Now, Joshua Harris was at one time a very well-known evangelical pastor who was an overseer at a very large church in Gaithersburg, Maryland. He was a prominent voice in the Young, Restless, and Reformed movement, and he was the author of a best-selling book at a very young age titled I Kissed Dating Goodbye. He recently did a documentary about the effects that his book had on individuals in evangelicalism, broadly speaking. And for the sake of full disclosure, I should note that I was in fact interviewed for that film, though my interview was not used in the film. So this is what Mr. Harris has written. He says, "We're writing to share the news that we are separating and will continue our life together as friends. In recent years, some significant changes have taken place in both of us. It is with sincere love for one another and understanding of our unique story as a couple that we are moving forward with this decision. We hope to create a generous and supportive future for each other and for our 3 amazing children in the years ahead. Thank you for our understanding and respecting our privacy during a difficult time." So the first thing to note is that Mr. Harris, who was the advocate for courtship in his book, I Kissed Dating Goodbye, and later in his book, Boy Meets Girl, has announced his divorce from his wife, Miss Shannon Bond. But then we have this post from Instagram. Notice the mood photograph of Mr. Harris staring out at a beautiful lake. He writes, "My heart is full of gratitude. I wish you could see all the messages people sent me after the announcement of my divorce. Their expressions of love, though they are saddened or even strongly disapprove of the decision. I am learning that no group has the market cornered on grace. This week I've received grace from Christians, atheists, evangelicals, ex-evangelicals, straight people, LGBTQ people, and everyone in between. Of course, there have been strong words of rebuke from religious people. While not always pleasant, I know they're seeking to love me. There have also been spiteful, hateful comments that angered and hurt me. The information that was left out of our announcement is that I have undergone a massive shift in regard to my faith in Jesus. The popular phrase for this is deconstruction. The biblical phrase is falling away. By all the measurements that I have for defining a Christian, I am not a Christian. Many people tell me that there is a different way to practice faith, and I want to remain open to this, but I'm not there now. Martin Luther said that the entire life of believers should be repentance. There's beauty in that sentiment, regardless of your view of God. I have lived in repentance for the past several years, repenting of my self-righteousness, my fear-based approach to life, the teaching of my books, my views of women in the church, and my approach to parenting, to name a few. But I specifically want to add to this list now. To the LGBTQ plus community, I want to say that I am sorry for the views that I taught in my books and as a pastor regarding sexuality. I regret standing against marriage equality and not affirming you and your place in the church, and for any ways that my writing and speaking contributed to a culture of exclusion and bigotry. I hope you can forgive me." He goes on to thank his Christian friends for their prayers and ask them if they don't, that they not take it personally if he doesn't immediately return their calls. But this is perhaps the biggest news in the Christian world of the past couple of weeks, the apostasy of a formerly well-known pastor in the young, restless, and reformed community. But I think that it shouldn't be overlooked that this is part of a larger trajectory that we've seen with the leadership of the young, restless, and reformed movement. Over and over again now, we've seen these well-known names, C.J. Mahaney, Tullian Tchividjian, and now Joshua Harris, among others. Mark Driscoll also comes to mind, that have gone through a very public implosion. And I think that this needs to make us ask some questions, not least of which about celebrity Christian culture. You see, I'm concerned that instead of the pastor that's working in a rural church, like so many of the pastors that I know and with whom I'm friends, we have elevated men to platforms simply because of the size of their congregation or because of the size of their influence. And one of the most dangerous things that Christians can do is seek influence in the larger culture and world. You see, this world is not our home. This world is always going to have strong feelings about what we believe, teach, and confess as Christians. And what we have to say should always and at every turn be countercultural. And when we start turning influence into an idol, what we are attempting to do is leverage our cultural cachet in order to get a larger microphone and a larger stage. And I find it worth noting here as well that, despite his plea for privacy in his previous post, Mr. Harris certainly isn't posting his thoughts privately. Instead, he is putting them up publicly on Instagram for everyone to see. So while this is sad, it should be a reminder to us that John was right when he wrote in 1 John that there will be many that go out from us, but they were not truly of us. I should also point out that I sincerely hope for Mr. Harris that this is simply a wandering away rather than a permanent loss of faith and a permanent exit from the Christian faith. That's the news for today. I hope that you guys were able to get something from this. If you enjoyed this video, please, by all means, subscribe to the channel so that you can get updates. With all of that being said, God bless you. I hope you've had a great week, and I hope you have a good weekend to come. Hey guys, thanks for sticking around for the end of the video. I just want to say thank you for all of your support. And guys, if you're being helped by the content that I'm producing, please subscribe to the channel so that you can get updates. Give the video a like, and if you've got questions, leave them in the comments section below. I've really enjoyed this, and I hope you have. So thank you all. God bless.